The sweat was pouring down my face as I watched Sheriff Corinne yank the electrical cords from the wall. Elderly, Mrs. Henderson was gasping for air in her wheelchair, and 3 young children were crying as the temperature climbed past 90 degrees inside what used to be our safe haven. Corinne looked me dead in the eye and said with a cold smile, "Try to plug those back in, and I will arrest you for interfering with official business." That was the moment I realized this woman was willing to let innocent people suffer just to prove she had power over us. What she did not know was that, in 3 minutes, I was about to show her what real power looked like. The summer of 2024 hit our small town like a furnace door swinging open. Day after day, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees, turning sidewalks into griddles and making the air shimmer like water. Our little community had never experienced anything like this heat wave, and the weather reports kept promising more of the same for at least another week. I had been volunteering at the community cooling center for 3 days straight when I truly understood how desperate things had become. The center was housed in the old community hall on Main Street, a building that had seen better days, but served its purpose when the industrial air conditioning units were running full blast. Every morning, I would arrive at 7 to unlock the doors and prepare for the steady stream of people who had nowhere else to escape the deadly heat. Mrs. Henderson was always my first visitor. At 82 years old, she lived alone in a trailer without air conditioning, and her oxygen concentrator made the heat even more dangerous for her breathing. She would wheel herself through our doors every morning, her face flushed red from the short journey across the parking lot. "Thank you, honey," she would whisper as the cool air hit her face. "I do not know what I would do without this place." The Martinez family became regulars too. Carlos worked construction, and his wife Maria cleaned houses, but their paychecks could not stretch to cover the electric bill if they ran their old window unit all day. Their 3 children, ages 5 to 12, would spread out on the cool linoleum floor with coloring books and puzzles, while their parents took turns napping in the folding chairs we had set up along the walls. By noon each day, the center was packed. Teenagers whose families crowded into small apartments. Elderly folks whose fixed incomes meant choosing between medicine and electricity. Young mothers with bobbies who could not afford to run air conditioning while their partners worked double shifts in the heat. The sound of quiet conversations mixed with the blessed hum of those industrial cooling units working overtime to keep us all safe. I moved through these scenes like a shepherd tending his flock, refilling water stations, checking on the most vulnerable visitors, coordinating with other volunteers who brought sandwiches and snacks. The crisis had brought our community together in a way I had never seen before. Neighbors helping neighbors, sharing resources, making sure everyone had a safe place to wait out the brutal heat. The weather reports offered no hope. The meteorologist on Channel 7 kept talking about a high-pressure system that had settled over our region like a dome, trapping the hot air and preventing any relief. Utility companies were begging customers to conserve energy, warning that the power grid was straining under the demand for air conditioning. Every evening, I would drive home wondering how much longer we could keep the center running if the electricity costs kept climbing. But we had to keep it running. Lives depended on it. I had seen what happened to Mrs. Peterson the previous summer when she tried to tough out a 3-day heat wave in her apartment. The paramedics found her collapsed on her kitchen floor, her body temperature dangerously high, her heart struggling to cope with the stress. She spent a week in the hospital and never quite recovered her strength. That was not going to happen on my watch. Not this time. The cooling center had become more than just a place to escape the heat. It was a lifeline, a sanctuary, a place where the most vulnerable members of our community could find safety and human connection during a genuine emergency. Every person who walked through those doors mattered. Every life we protected was a victory against the indifferent forces of nature and circumstance. As I locked up the center that Tuesday evening, watching the last visitors reluctantly head back into the oppressive heat, I felt proud of what we had accomplished. We were saving lives, plain and simple. The cool air inside that building was the difference between safety and suffering, between community care and abandonment. I had no idea that everything was about to change. Wednesday morning started like any other day during the heat wave. I arrived at the cooling center before 7, unlocked the doors, and began my routine of checking the temperature controls and filling water stations. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in her wheelchair as usual, and I helped her navigate through the entrance while the cool air rushed out to greet us both. The morning was peaceful until Sheriff Karen burst through our doors like a thunderstorm at 10:30. Her heavy boots echoed against the linoleum as every conversation in the room stopped dead. She wore her authority like armor, clipboard clutched tight in her left hand, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead despite being indoors. "Who is in charge of this operation?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the cool air with sharp efficiency. The dozen people scattered around the room all turned to look at me, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized this was not going to be a friendly visit. "I am one of the volunteer coordinators," I said, walking toward her with what I hoped was a calm expression. "How can we help you today?" Karen looked me up and down like she was sizing up a suspect. "I am conducting an inspection of this facility. I have received complaints about overcrowding and fire code violations." My heart started pounding, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "We have been very careful about capacity limits. We have never had more than the posted maximum occupancy in here at one time." "That is not for you to determine," Karen snapped, pulling out her clipboard and making notes. "I need to see your permits, your occupancy documentation, and your safety inspection records immediately." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, but not from the air conditioning. Mrs. Henderson was watching with worried eyes while the Martinez children pressed closer to their mother. Everyone could feel the tension building, the sense that something was very wrong with this picture. "The community center has all the proper permits on file," I explained, trying not to let my growing anger show. "This is an emergency cooling center, authorized by the county health department due to the heat wave emergency." Karen stepped closer, using her height and uniform to intimidate me. "I do not see any posted documentation of emergency authorization. Until I can verify that this operation is legal, I am ordering an immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel." "Non-essential personnel?" I stared at her in disbelief. "These are people seeking refuge from deadly heat. Mrs. Henderson has breathing problems. The Martinez family has 3 young children. Where exactly do you expect them to go when it is 105 degrees outside?" "That is not my concern," Karen said coldly. "My concern is public safety and code compliance. If people are gathering in an unpermitted facility, they are creating a hazard." I felt my face getting hot, and not from the weather. The real hazard is forcing vulnerable people back into the heat during an emergency. Surely you can see that common sense should prevail here. Karen removed her sunglasses and stared at me with eyes as cold as winter. "Are you questioning my authority and my judgment as an elected law enforcement official?" The room had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something dangerous was happening. Mrs. Henderson was gripping the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white with tension. Maria Martinez had gathered her children close, whispering reassurances in Spanish while keeping her eyes fixed on the confrontation. I am simply advocating for the safety and well-being of community members who have nowhere else to go, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. Surely, we can work together to find a solution that keeps people safe while addressing any legitimate concerns you might have. Karen stepped back and surveyed the room like a general reviewing troops. Her gaze lingered on each person, as if memorizing faces for future reference. When she looked back at me, there was something like satisfaction in her expression. "I will give you 30 minutes to begin the evacuation process," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Anyone still here after 11 o'clock will be subject to citation for trespassing in an unpermitted facility." "But where are they supposed to go?" I asked desperately. Karen smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. "That sounds like a personal problem." She turned on her heel and walked toward the electrical panels mounted on the far wall, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon she was preparing to use. What happened next will be burned into my memory forever. Sheriff Karen walked directly to the electrical panel that controlled our air conditioning system, her boots clicking with mechanical precision across the floor. She set her clipboard down on a nearby table and began examining the circuit breakers with the focused attention of someone who had planned this moment carefully. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" I called out, following her across the room. "You cannot just start messing with our electrical systems." "I am conducting a safety inspection," Karen replied without looking up. "These units appear to be drawing excessive power, which could create a fire hazard." My blood ran cold as I watched her locate the main breakers that controlled the industrial air conditioning units. Her fingers moved with deliberate purpose, flipping switches and pulling connections with the kind of methodical cruelty that takes my breath away even now. "Stop," I shouted. "You are going to kill people. Mrs. Henderson has breathing problems and these children cannot handle this heat." Karen looked at me with those same cold eyes. "Anyone who interferes with an official safety inspection will be arrested for obstruction of justice." The first air conditioning unit died with a mechanical groan that echoed through the room like a death rattle. Within seconds, the blessed hum of cooling air was replaced by an ominous silence. Karen moved to the next panel, her movements quick and efficient. "Please," I begged, "these people have nowhere else to go. You are putting lives at risk." "That is not my problem," Karen said as she killed the second unit. "My job is to enforce the law and ensure public safety through proper regulations." The temperature in the room began to climb immediately. I could see beads of sweat forming on foreheads as the oppressive heat from outside began to seep through the walls and windows. Mrs. Henderson started fanning herself with a pamphlet, her breathing becoming more labored by the minute. "Mama, it is getting hot in here," whimpered the youngest Martinez child. Karen moved to the final electrical panel with the same mechanical precision. Her face showed no emotion, no recognition of the suffering she was causing. She might as well have been disconnecting equipment in an empty building for all the humanity she displayed. "I will have you arrested if you touch that last unit," I warned, stepping between her and the panel. Karen smiled that cold smile again. "And I will have you arrested if you do not move aside immediately." She reached around me and yanked the final electrical connection from the wall. The last air conditioning unit shuddered to a stop, leaving us in complete silence except for the sound of frightened breathing and a baby starting to cry. The heat began rising like invisible flames. Within minutes, the temperature climbed from a comfortable 72 degrees toward the oppressive heat that matched the conditions outside. Karen surveyed her handiwork with obvious satisfaction. This facility is now closed pending proper inspection and documentation, she announced to the room full of sweating, frightened people. Anyone remaining after 15 minutes will be cited for trespassing. She picked up her clipboard, walked to the door, and paused for one final look at the chaos she had created. Mrs. Henderson was struggling with her breathing, while children cried and parents frantically fanned them with whatever they could find. "Have a blessed day," Corinne said with mock sweetness, and walked out into the blazing heat, leaving us trapped in our own version of hell. The moment Sheriff Corinne disappeared through the door, chaos erupted around me. Mrs. Henderson was already showing signs of distress, her face flushed red and her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The Martinez children were crying as sweat began to bead on their foreheads, and their mother was frantically trying to comfort them while looking around desperately for any source of relief. "We need to get these people cooled down immediately," I said to Janet, another volunteer who had arrived just as Corinne was leaving. "Open every window and door, get whatever fans we can find, and somebody call 911. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my cell phone and started making emergency calls. First to the mayor's office, then to the county health department, then to anyone I could think of who might have the authority to override Sheriff Corinne's destructive orders. "Mayor Wilson's office," came the voice on the other end. "This is an emergency," I said, trying to keep my voice calm while sweat was already dripping down my face. "Sheriff Corinne just shut down our emergency cooling center during a heat wave. We have elderly people and children here who are at risk of heat stroke. I am sorry, but the mayor is in meetings all morning. Can I take a message?" "People could die," I shouted into the phone. "This is not a message situation." But the bureaucratic runaround had already begun. The mayor was unavailable. The county health department said they could not override local law enforcement decisions. The state emergency management office said they would look into it and get back to me. Meanwhile, the temperature inside the building was climbing toward 80 degrees and rising fast. Janet had found 2 box fans in a storage closet, but they were just pushing hot air around. Mrs. Henderson was struggling to breathe, and I could see the panic in her eyes. "Honey, I need to get out of here," she whispered, "but I cannot make it to my car in this heat." I knelt beside her wheelchair, my heart breaking as I watched this strong woman reduced to helplessness by one person's cruelty. "We are going to figure this out, Mrs. Henderson. I promise you we are not going to let anything happen to you." But even as I said the words, I felt the crushing weight of helplessness. Corinne had the badge, the authority, and the legal backing to do whatever she wanted. We were just ordinary citizens trying to help each other survive, and the system seemed designed to protect her abuse of power rather than the people she was supposed to serve. That was when I started making different kinds of phone calls. To my brother-in-law who worked in HVAC, to my neighbor who ran a small business and understood legal regulations, to anyone who might know how to fight back against this kind of bureaucratic terrorism. "Tom, I need your help," I said when my brother-in-law answered. "We have an emergency situation, and I need to know about portable cooling options." "What kind of situation are we talking about?" Tom asked. I explained what had happened, and I could hear the anger building in his voice. "That is completely illegal," he said. "She had no authority to disconnect functioning safety equipment during an emergency, but proving that will take time you do not have." "What about mobile cooling units?" I asked. "Industrial trailers, anything that could provide immediate relief." "There are companies that rent climate-control trailers for events and emergencies," Tom said. "But they are expensive, and it would take time to arrange." "How much time?" If I call in favors and pay rush charges, maybe 3 hours. I looked around the room at the suffering faces, at Mrs. Henderson struggling with every breath, at children wilting in the rising heat. Do it, I said. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. These people cannot wait for the bureaucracy to sort itself out. While Tom made his calls, I started documenting everything. Photos of the disconnected electrical panels, video of the rising temperature on the thermostat, interviews with the people who were suffering because of Corinne's actions. If we were going to fight this battle, we needed evidence. The breakthrough came when Janet connected me with her cousin who worked as a paralegal. What Corinne did was criminal endangerment, she explained over the phone. She deliberately created a life-threatening situation for vulnerable people during a declared emergency. That is not law enforcement. That is abuse of power. Can we prove that? I asked. With the right documentation and witnesses. Absolutely. But more importantly, you can fight back immediately. Citizens have the right to protect themselves and others from immediate harm, even if it means defying an illegal order. For the first time since Corinne had walked through our doors, I felt a spark of hope. She might have the badge and the authority, but we had something more powerful. We had the law, the truth, and a community that refused to let its most vulnerable members suffer in silence. The counterattack was about to begin. While Mrs. Henderson and the other victims of Corinne's cruelty waited in the sweltering heat, I was coordinating the most important battle of my life from my kitchen table. Legal documents, phone numbers, and handwritten notes covered every surface as allies emerged from places I never expected. My brother-in-law Tom called back within the hour with news that changed everything. I found a company in the next county that specializes in emergency climate control, he said. They have a 40-foot trailer unit that can cool a space twice the size of your community center. The owner is a veteran who served in Iraq, and when I told him what happened, he said he would drive it over himself. How much is this going to cost? I asked, knowing that my savings account was not exactly overflowing. That is the beautiful part, Tom replied. When word got out about what Corinne did, local businesses started stepping up. The hardware store is covering the rental fee. The diner is paying for fuel. Even the bank president called to offer financial support. I felt tears of gratitude mixing with the sweat on my face. Our small town was proving that community spirit could overcome individual cruelty, but we still had bigger battles ahead. The legal research was revealing just how far Corinne had overstepped her authority. Janet's cousin had connected me with a retired lawyer named Robert Chen who specialized in civil rights cases. His analysis was devastating to Corinne's position. What she did was criminal, Robert explained during our phone conversation. She endangered lives during a declared emergency without proper authority or justification. Sheriff or not, she violated multiple state regulations and potentially federal civil rights laws. But can we do anything about it right now? I asked. These people need help today, not after months of legal proceedings. Absolutely, Robert said with conviction. Citizens have the right to protect themselves from immediate harm. If someone is creating a life-threatening situation through abuse of authority, you have the legal right to take reasonable steps to ensure safety. That conversation gave me the confidence to move forward with our plan, but Robert also warned me about the risks. Corinne will try to retaliate, he said. People like her do not back down when challenged. They escalate. You need to be prepared for her to come back harder. What do you recommend? Documentation, witnesses, media coverage. Make everything public so she cannot operate in the shadows. Sunlight is the best disinfectant for corruption. That advice sparked the next phase of our strategy. I started making calls to local media, social media contacts, and anyone with a platform who could help expose what was happening. The response was immediate and overwhelming. "This is exactly the kind of story our viewers care about," said Jennifer from Channel 7 News. "David versus Goliath, community standing up to abuse of power. Can you give us exclusive access when the trailer arrives?" "Absolutely," I replied. "But I want to make sure the focus stays on the people who were victimized, not on making me look like some kind of hero." Social media was exploding with support as word spread about Corinne's actions. People were sharing stories of their own encounters with her heavy-handed tactics. Business owners talked about harassment over minor permit issues. Families described being targeted for personal vendettas. A pattern of abuse was emerging that went far beyond what happened at the cooling center. The most powerful moment came when Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter called me from 2 states away. "I saw the posts about what happened to my grandmother," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I am driving down tonight with a camera crew from the network affiliate where I work. This story needs to go national." By evening, our simple plan to provide cooling relief had evolved into something much bigger. We were not just fighting for air conditioning. We were taking on a system that allowed people with badges to abuse vulnerable citizens without consequences. The climate control trailer was scheduled to arrive at dawn, but more importantly, we had built a coalition of supporters who were ready to stand up to Corinne when she inevitably returned. Local business owners, retired military veterans, legal advocates, media professionals, and ordinary citizens who were tired of being pushed around by someone who had forgotten that her job was to serve and protect, not intimidate and control. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Robert Chen asked during our final planning call. "Once that trailer arrives and you publicly challenge her authority, there is no going back. She will come after you with everything she has." I looked at the photos on my phone from that morning. Mrs. Henderson struggling to breathe, children crying from the heat, elderly people suffering because one person decided to play God with their lives. "I have been ready since the moment she pulled those plugs," I said. "Tomorrow, we show her that badges do not make someone above the law." The stage was set for a confrontation that would define our community for years to come. Thursday morning arrived with the rumble of diesel engines and the sweet sound of justice rolling down Main Street. I was at the cooling center by 6 a.m., coordinating with the early volunteers who had shown up to witness what we hoped would be a turning point in our community's fight against abuse of power. The climate control trailer was even more impressive than I had imagined. 40 feet of professional-grade cooling equipment mounted on a heavy-duty truck chassis, with backup generators and enough capacity to cool a building twice the size of our community center. The company logo on the side read, "Emergency Climate Solutions." But to me, it looked like a white knight arriving to save the day. Jake Morrison, the veteran who owned the company, climbed down from the cab with the bearing of someone who had seen real combat and was not impressed by small-town bullies. "Where do you want her?" he asked, gesturing toward the massive trailer. "Right there," I said, pointing to a spot directly in front of the community center where it would be visible from the street. "I want everyone to see that the community takes care of its own." Within an hour, the trailer was positioned and connected. Industrial-grade cooling units hummed to life with the kind of professional efficiency that made Corinne's sabotage look petty and amateur by comparison. The contrast was striking and deliberate. She had used her badge to create suffering. We were using our resources and determination to provide relief. Mrs. Henderson was among the first to arrive, her granddaughter pushing her wheelchair while a camera crew documented every moment. "Oh my goodness," she whispered as the cool air hit her face. "This is like heaven after yesterday." The Martinez family came next, the children running ahead to feel the blessed relief of air conditioning while their parents fought back tears of gratitude. Word was spreading through social media and local networks. People were not just coming for the cooling. They were coming to be part of something bigger. By 9 a.m., the scene had transformed into something between a community celebration and a peaceful protest. Local news crews were setting up equipment. Business owners were arriving with donations of water and snacks. Families were bringing elderly relatives who needed relief from the heat. And through it all, the professional climate control system hummed efficiently, providing exactly what Karen had tried to deny our community. The social media response was overwhelming. Videos of the trailer arrival were being shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from people across the state expressing support and outrage about Karen's actions. The hashtag #CommunityOverCorruption was trending locally, and national media outlets were starting to pick up the story. "This is exactly what grassroots resistance looks like," said Maria Santos, a political blogger who had driven over from the county seat to cover the story. One person abuses power, and the community responds with organized, legal, and effective action. The legal team that Robert Chen had assembled was documenting everything. Photos of the professional setup contrasted with images of Karen's sabotage. Interviews with affected families provided emotional testimony about the impact of her actions. Expert witnesses were prepared to testify about the health risks she had created. But the most powerful moment came when other victims of Karen's abuse began arriving to share their stories. Tom Rodriguez, whose food truck had been shut down over what he claimed were fabricated health violations. Sarah Mitchell, whose teenage son had been arrested for resisting arrest during a routine traffic stop that seemed designed to escalate into conflict. Bob Peterson, whose small business had been harassed with surprise inspections every month for the past 2 years. "She has been abusing her authority for years," Sarah said to the news cameras. "We just never had the courage to stand up to her before, but what she did yesterday crossed a line that we cannot ignore." The momentum was building towards something that felt unstoppable. Community members were energized. Media attention was growing. Legal support was organized. The climate control trailer was providing undeniable proof that solutions existed when people worked together instead of tearing each other down. That was when Karen's patrol car came screeching into the parking lot. She climbed out of the vehicle with the aggressive posture of someone who was not prepared to back down from a fight. Her uniform was crisp, her badge polished, her hand resting on her radio as if she was preparing to call for backup. But something was different this time. Instead of facing a few scared volunteers in an empty building, she was confronting a crowd of determined citizens, rolling news cameras, and a professional operation that made her petty sabotage look ridiculous. The crowd that had gathered became protective and vocal. No longer intimidated by her badge or threats, they formed a loose circle around the trailer and the cooling center entrance. Children played safely in the background while adults stood their ground with quiet determination. "What is the meaning of this unauthorized equipment?" Karen demanded, her voice carrying across the parking lot. I stepped forward, no longer the frightened volunteer she had bullied the day before. "This is a legally permitted emergency cooling operation, conducted by licensed professionals on public property with full community support." Karen's face was already flushed, whether from the heat or from rage, I could not tell. But her eyes were scanning the crowd, the cameras, the professional equipment, looking for some angle of attack that would restore her sense of control. She was about to discover that control, once lost, is very difficult to regain. Sheriff Karen stood in the middle of that parking lot like a gunfighter who had walked into the wrong saloon. The confidence and arrogance that had defined her the day before were cracking under the pressure of public scrutiny and organized resistance. She was used to intimidating isolated individuals in private encounters. This was something entirely different. "I am ordering the immediate shutdown of this unauthorized operation," she announced, raising her voice to carry over the murmur of the crowd. "This equipment does not have proper permits, and this gathering violates multiple municipal ordinances." That was when Robert Chen stepped forward with a folder full of documents. "Actually, Sheriff, this operation is fully permitted under emergency authority granted by the county health department," he said calmly. "All documentation is properly filed and available for your review." Karen's face grew redder. "I do not recognize your authority to supersede my law enforcement decisions. And I do not recognize your authority to endanger lives during a declared emergency," Robert replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew the law better than she did. "What you did yesterday was criminal endangerment, and these citizens have the legal right to protect themselves from further abuse." The crowd was growing larger and more vocal. People were filming with their phones, broadcasting live on social media, and providing real-time commentary that was spreading the story far beyond our small town. Karen was no longer controlling the narrative. She was reacting to events that were spinning beyond her influence. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately," Karen tried again, her voice starting to crack under the pressure. "This is an unlawful assembly. This is a lawful gathering of citizens exercising their constitutional rights," came a voice from the crowd. It was Tom Rodriguez, the food truck owner whose business Karen had targeted. "And we are not going anywhere until you explain why you tried to kill elderly people yesterday." That opened the floodgates. One by one, other victims of Karen's abuse began stepping forward to share their stories with the news cameras and the growing crowd. Sarah Mitchell talked about her son's bogus arrest. Bob Peterson described years of harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Williams, an elderly woman I had never met before, told the crowd about Karen threatening to have her evicted from public housing over a complaint about loud music that was never actually filed. Each story painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond yesterday's cooling center incident. Karen had been using her badge as a weapon against anyone who crossed her or challenged her authority. The pattern was clear, documented, and undeniable. "These are all lies," Karen protested, but her voice sounded desperate rather than authoritative. "These people are making false accusations against a law enforcement officer." "Then you should welcome a full investigation," Robert Chen replied smoothly. "If these allegations are false, a proper inquiry will clear your name. If they are true, then justice needs to be served." The media attention was intensifying by the minute. Local news crews were getting exclusive interviews with victims. Social media was exploding with shares and comments from people across the region who were expressing outrage about the abuse and support for our community's response. The story was taking on a life of its own. But the moment that changed everything came when Karen made a fatal mistake. Frustrated by her loss of control and desperate to reassert her authority, she reached for her radio and called for backup. "I need additional units at the community center," she said into the handset. "I have a crowd situation that needs immediate control." The response came back loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sheriff, this is Captain Williams from county headquarters. We have been monitoring this situation, and you are ordered to stand down immediately. Return to headquarters for debriefing." The crowd went silent. Corinne's face went white. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant had just happened. "I repeat," came the voice over the radio, "you are ordered to return to headquarters immediately. Do not take any further law enforcement action at this location." Corinne stared at the radio in her hand like it had betrayed her. The authority she had wielded so carelessly was evaporating in real time, in front of cameras and witnesses who would remember this moment forever. "This is not over," she said, looking directly at me with hatred that was almost physical in its intensity. "You are right," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "It is not over, but it is over for you." Corinne walked back to her patrol car with the defeated posture of someone whose world had just collapsed. As she drove away, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Children were laughing in the cool air conditioning. Elderly people were crying with relief. Media crews were wrapping up interviews that would spread our story across the region. But the best part was watching Mrs. Henderson, sitting comfortably in her wheelchair in the blessed cool air, surrounded by friends and family and community members who had refused to let her suffer in silence. "We did it," she whispered to me, tears streaming down her face. "We actually did it." "No, ma'am," I replied, looking around at the crowd of ordinary people who had accomplished something extraordinary. "You did it, all of you. This is what happens when good people refuse to be pushed around." The reckoning was complete, but the consequences were just beginning. The official notification arrived by certified mail 3 days later. Sheriff Corinne was suspended immediately pending a full investigation into her conduct, with potential criminal charges for endangering public welfare during an emergency. The letter was signed by the county sheriff's department, the state police, and the district attorney's office. Justice, it seemed, moved quickly when enough people were paying attention. The cooling center reopened with new protections that ensured no single official could threaten this vital community service again. The county passed emergency legislation requiring multiple approvals before any essential services could be disrupted, and established an oversight board with community representation to prevent future abuse of authority. Mrs. Henderson was back in her familiar spot by the window, breathing easily in the cool air, while her granddaughter interviewed other community members for a documentary about grassroots resistance to corruption. The Martinez children were playing board games on the floor, safe and comfortable while their parents worked their shifts knowing their kids had somewhere safe to spend the hot afternoons. The climate control trailer remained parked outside as a backup system and a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they refused to accept injustice. Jake Morrison, the veteran who owned the company, had donated the trailer to our town permanently. "You folks showed that ordinary citizens can stand up to bullies," he said. "That deserves support." But the real satisfaction came from watching Corinne face the consequences of her actions. The investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct that stretched back years. Fabricated reports, falsified evidence, harassment of vulnerable citizens, and abuse of emergency authority. The list of charges grew longer as more victims found the courage to come forward. Her pension was revoked. Her law enforcement certification was permanently canceled. She faced criminal charges that could result in significant jail time. The reputation and authority she had wielded like weapons were completely destroyed, replaced by the humiliation of public exposure and legal accountability. The financial consequences were devastating too. Legal fees drained her savings as she hired lawyer after lawyer to fight charges that were supported by overwhelming evidence. The civil lawsuits from victims of her abuse would continue for years, ensuring that she would never profit from her misconduct. More importantly, the systemic changes ensured that no future Sheriff Karen could terrorize our community. New oversight procedures required transparency and accountability. Community representation on law enforcement review boards gave citizens real power to address abuse. Training programs emphasized service over authority, protection over control. The media attention brought unexpected benefits to our town. Businesses reported increased tourism from people who wanted to support a community that had stood up to corruption. Grants and donations flowed in from organizations dedicated to civil rights and community empowerment. Our story became a case study in effective grassroots organizing.